This is Samuel. Humiliation came for him at 10,000 meters of altitude, disguised as a safety procedure. At the moment, a pilot with an accusatory finger ordered him and his 8-year-old son to leave the aircraft. All because of a prejudice that could not be named, but that hung in the air like smoke from a fire. The pain of seeing his son targeted by such a cruel injustice was a knife that cut his soul. A man's faith can be measured by how he reacts when the world tries to crush him in front of his own child. Has yours ever been tested in this way? Before I tell you how God used the mouth of a child to shame that man's arrogance, comment here where you are watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when we place such a humiliation in his hands. That day had begun with a purpose of love. Samuel and his little David were on their way to the boy's grandmother's house, who was facing a severe illness. For them, that trip was not just a journey, but a mission of faith. They carried in their luggage not only clothes, but the hope that their presence, their prayers, and the grandson's embrace could bring a breath of healing and comfort. The atmosphere of the plane was the usual, a mixture of voices, the click of seatbelts, and the controlled anxiety that precedes takeoff. Samuel felt a calm filled with expectation in his chest, observing his son with serene pride. Little did he know that this confined space, full of strangers, was about to transform into a tribunal where his faith would be publicly judged. David, sitting glued to the window, was a well of fascination. His little eyes shone, following the movement of the workers on the tarmac, the baggage carts, the other planes in the distance. With the innocence of his 8 years, he tapped his feet lightly on the floor in an almost imperceptible rhythm while quietly humming a gospel song that his sick grandmother loved so much. It was a murmur of joy, a pure expression of his happy anticipation. Samuel saw this and smiled. He had taught his son that God rejoices in a content heart, and David's heart, at that moment, was overflowing. There was no malice there, only the vibrant energy of a child who saw the world as a great and wonderful adventure prepared by God. It was at that moment that Commander Ribeiro passed through the aisle. He did not walk. He marched, with an aura of tense and impatient authority. His gaze did not seek to reassure the passengers, but rather to sniff out anything out of place, any deviation from his absolute control. When his eyes fell on Samuel and David, it was as if a lens of prejudice distorted the entire scene. He did not see a happy boy and a loving father. He saw a black boy whom he considered undisciplined, and a father who, in his distorted view, seemed passive and negligent. Samuel's serenity, which was the fruit of his deep faith, was interpreted by the pilot as weakness, an invitation for the abuse of power that was about to happen. Without hesitation, the pilot stopped beside their seat. His voice cut through the air, harsh and loud enough for everyone around to turn. "Sir, please control your son. This behavior is not acceptable." Samuel, caught by surprise, looked at the commander, and then at David, who stopped humming, shrinking in his seat. Before he could respond, the pilot continued, now with a definitive tone. "For safety reasons, and to ensure a peaceful flight, I am going to ask you and the boy to disembark." The sentence landed like a stone in Samuel's stomach. The pretext was vague, the humiliation public and crushing. The world seemed to slow down, the hum of the plane disappeared, and all that existed was the arrogant face of that man and the curious and judgmental gazes of the other passengers. In that second, a primitive and righteous fury exploded inside Samuel's chest. It was the lion that every father carries within him, ready to protect his cub at any cost. The urge was to stand up, to use the voice he rarely raised to expose the injustice, to shout that this was prejudice, that his son was just a happy child. He felt the blood rush to his face, his muscles tensing. The world was provoking him, the devil whispering in his ear that it was his right to fight back, that faith also required fighting against evil. But, as quickly as it came, this wave of anger met a wall built over 42 years of knees on the ground and silent conversations with God. The weight of the stairs was overwhelming. He could feel the impatience of some, the veiled contempt of others, and, what was perhaps worse, the cowardly compassion of a minority who saw the injustice but remained silent, afraid to get involved. To many there, they were just the problem delaying the trip, a black father and his restless son. The stereotype was materializing live, and Samuel felt the pain of being reduced to a caricature, of having his and his son's dignity stripped away by a man hiding behind a uniform. Every second of silence was a new layer of humiliation being deposited on his shoulders. A quick memory, like a flash, invaded his mind. He saw himself at 10 years old, crying with anger after being insulted by a neighbor. His father, a man with calloused hands and few words, did not tell him to fight. He just knelt, looked into his eyes and said, "My son, there are fights we don't win by shouting. There are insults we swallow, hand over, to God and wait. His justice never fails, but it comes in its own time, not ours." That memory, stored deep in his soul, was the anchor that held him. He was not weak. He was obedient to a wisdom the world did not understand. Ignoring the pilot, who was still staring at him impatiently, Samuel made a decision that shocked everyone. He turned to the narrow aisle and, with a calm that seemed supernatural, knelt on the floor. The gesture was so unexpected that an uncomfortable silence took over the cabin. Kneeling, he was at the same height as David, who looked at him with eyes full of tears and confusion. Samuel placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture that said, "I am here, I am in control, trust me." He transformed that aisle of humiliation into a sacred altar, a private sanctuary amidst dozens of perplexed gazes. With a low but firm voice, enough for those closest to hear, he said, "Son, we are not going to fight. We are going to pray. Close your eyes. God is seeing all of this." David obeyed, his small eyelids closing and hiding the tears. Samuel also closed his. He did not confront the man's authority with the fury of the flesh, but confronted the world's injustice with the strength of the spirit. There, on his knees, he surrendered the pain, the humiliation, the anger, the protection of his son, everything, into God's hands. The plane, once noisy, fell silent. Everyone expected a scandal, a heated argument. Instead, they received a demonstration of faith that left them completely disarmed and silent. The silence that settled was denser than the thin air of the cabin. It was not a silence of respect, but of bewilderment and discomfort. The passengers, who had been whispering and looking on with disdain, were now motionless, as if caught off guard by a scene they did not know how to interpret. Some frowned, clearly irritated by the new delay this scene was causing. Others, however, had a different glint in their eyes, a mixture of curiosity and perhaps even a hint of shame. That kneeling man praying in silence was a mirror reflecting the passivity and haste of everyone there. Samuel's prayer was not audible, but its power was felt, creating a bubble of sanctity that no one dared to pierce with a word. Inside, in the silent conversation with God, Samuel did not ask for revenge or for immediate justice. His prayer was a father's plea. "Lord, guard my son's heart. Don't let this evil take root in him. Give me your peace, your wisdom, to go through this without sinning, without giving the enemy what he wants, my anger, my scandal. You are my advocate, the judge of all causes. I deliver this man, this humiliation, into your hands. Your will be done, not mine." Each word was a balm on his wounded soul, a way of transferring the crushing weight from his shoulders to someone infinitely stronger. He was not running from the fight. He was choosing the right weapon for it. Commander Ribeiro watched the scene with a mixture of disbelief and growing fury. To him, this was not faith, it was theater, a manipulation to embarrass him and win the sympathy of the other passengers. Samuel's calmness, instead of appeasing him, infuriated him even more, as it was a kind of power he could not intimidate with his rank. He saw it as an act of passive-aggressive defiance. "Enough of this show," he said, his voice hard, to a flight attendant who stood paralyzed nearby. "Call the gate agent. They are getting off now, one way or another. I will not tolerate this insubordination on my aircraft." His jaw was clenched, his face red from feeling challenged and humiliated in his own domain. The flight attendant, an older woman with a tired look, hesitated for a moment. She had seen everything in her years of flying. Drunk passengers, heated arguments, panic attacks, but never this. Never a man responding to a humiliating order with a prayer on his knees. There was a dignity in Samuel that disarmed her. She looked at his serene face, then at the cowering boy, and something in her heart moved. She didn't see a problem. She saw a father protecting his son in the only way he knew how. The pilot's order was clear, but for the first time, she felt a hint of resistance to blindly obeying. This was not a standard procedure. It was a clear and cruel injustice. Samuel felt the peace that only sincere prayer can bring. He opened his eyes slowly, as if returning from a distant place. The anger had dissipated, replaced by a firm serenity. He no longer needed to fight, for the battle was no longer his. With a slow and deliberate movement, he stood up, brushing the invisible dust from his knees. His gaze met David's, and he gave a slight smile, a sign that everything would be okay. He was ready to leave the plane, not as an expelled and defeated man, but as someone who chose obedience to God above his own pride. He would take his son's hand and leave with his head held high, leaving the judgment to whom it is due. As Samuel prepared to get the backpack from the overhead compartment, he felt an insistent tug on his shirt. It was David. The boy had opened his eyes, and there were no more tears in them, but a disconcerting clarity, a seriousness that did not belong to an 8-year-old child. He looked at his father with an urgency that made Samuel stop immediately. The boy's voice came out in a whisper, but it was charged with a conviction that echoed in Samuel's heart louder than any shout. It wasn't a whim. It wasn't fear. It was something else. It was a message that had crossed the veil of the visible world and found its way through the purity of a child who had just prayed with his father. "Dad," David whispered, pulling on Samuel's shirt again to ensure his full attention. "God told me we're not supposed to leave the plane." Samuel frowned, confused. He thought it might be the boy's fear speaking, a way to resist leaving. But David continued, his gaze fixed on the window. "He said the metal wing has a fever." "Right. Here, Dad." With his little finger, he pointed directly at the turbine shining under the sun outside. The simplicity and strangeness of the phrase, "metal wing with a fever," struck Samuel in a way no logical explanation could. This was not imagination. It was the language of God through his son. A shiver ran down Samuel's spine. He knew his son better than anyone. David was not a child to make up elaborate stories, especially not in such a tense moment. The word fever was his way of translating something he felt, something he saw in his spirit. Samuel looked from the window to his son's serious face and felt the weight of responsibility. Leaving the plane was the easy way, the path of apparent peace. Staying and conveying that bizarre message was to risk more humiliation, to be labeled a madman along with his son. But the faith that had made him kneel minutes before now demanded an even bolder step, to believe the voice of a child as if it were the voice of God himself. He stood up, not to get his things, but to address the flight attendant who was still hovering nearby, radio in hand, ready to call security. Samuel approached her with a calmness that was almost hypnotic. "Ma'am, please forgive the trouble," he began, his voice low and respectful. "I know this is going to sound strange, but I need to ask for something. My son, he received a message." He paused, knowing how insane it sounded. "He said the turbine on this wing has a fever. I just ask for everyone's safety, that the maintenance crew take one last look, just to be sure." His request was so sincere and devoid of arrogance that the woman was left speechless. Commander Ribeiro, approaching to hasten the expulsion, heard the request and let out a loud, scornful laugh. "A fever in the turbine? That's the best one I've ever heard. Now, besides being disruptive, they're mystics. Off the plane now." His cruelty was explicit. However, the flight attendant did not laugh. Samuel's gaze was steady and the seriousness on the boy's face was palpable. Perhaps it was procedure, perhaps a drop of doubt planted by the prayer scene, or perhaps the hand of God acting through her, but she ignored the pilot's laughter. She raised the radio to her mouth and, in a professional voice, reported to the ground crew, "We have a passenger reporting a visual anomaly on the right turbine, requesting a protocol check before departure." The flight attendant's communication landed like a silent bomb in the cabin. The commander's order was clear, but her action created a stalemate. The pilot shot her a look, a cold fury promising consequences. He felt his authority undermined, not just by a passenger, but now by a member of his own crew. For the passengers, the confusion grew. Some huffed with impatience, seeing this as another excuse to delay the flight. "Now we have to wait because of a boy's imaginary fever," muttered a man in a suit a few rows ahead. But others, especially those who had seen the prayer, fell silent, a seed of doubt beginning to sprout in their minds. What if there was some truth to it? The atmosphere on the plane became a mixture of skepticism, irritation, and a small, almost imperceptible flame of apprehensive curiosity. Samuel remained standing by his seat, his body erect but his heart pounding. He had done his part. He had given voice to the message entrusted to him, even at the risk of ridicule. Now the outcome was no longer in his hands. He placed a hand on David's head, a gesture of protection and reassurance. He did not look at the pilot or the other passengers. His eyes were fixed on the window, on the same turbine his son had pointed to. It was an act of blind faith, a total bet on a child's spiritual intuition against the logic, technology, and arrogance of the adult world. He felt, deep in his soul, that this moment was a watershed, a turning point where God was about to manifest himself. Outside, the movement on the tarmac changed. Two mechanics, who were already walking away from the aircraft, received the call on the radio. Their expression was one of pure boredom and obligation. It was clear they considered this a waste of time, a bureaucratic procedure to calm a neurotic passenger. One of them gestured impatiently, pointing at his watch. They walked back towards the right turbine with the slowness of someone carrying out a useless order. From inside the plane, the passengers closest to the window watched the scene with a mixture of interest and annoyance. For Commander Ribeiro, every second of that check was a personal affront, a testament to his authority being bypassed. He crossed his arms, tapping his foot on the ground, the very picture of impatience personified. One of the mechanics approached the enormous turbine. He didn't seem to be taking it seriously, just walking around it, performing a superficial, almost theatrical visual inspection. He gave a few taps on the metal casing, like someone checking a samusha, and gave a thumbs up to his colleague waiting at a distance. It seemed that Samuel's humiliation was about to be sealed. He would be proven wrong, branded a madman, and finally expelled. Samuel felt a pang of doubt. Had he misunderstood? Had he exposed his son to even greater shame? But then the second mechanic, perhaps a little older and more cautious, approached. Instead of just looking from the outside, he took out a flashlight and crouched down, directing the beam of light into the internal parts of the engine, through the gaps in the access panel. What followed was a drastic change in the man's body language. He, who had been relaxed and bored, suddenly became tense. He moved closer, almost pressing his face against the structure. He called his colleague with an urgent gesture. The first mechanic, who was already turning away, came back, his bored expression giving way to confusion. Together, the two looked at the same spot. From inside the plane, it was impossible to see what they saw, but the urgency in their movements was unmistakable. They began to speak rapidly into their radios, their voices no longer casual, but filled with alarm. The commander, who was watching the scene from afar, uncrossed his arms, his face contorting into a mask of confusion and apprehension. What was happening? Inside the plane, a murmur spread. The passengers who were complaining before were now leaning over their seats, trying to see what was happening outside. The tension that was previously caused by Samuel's humiliation was now different, a tension of genuine fear. The flight attendant who had relayed the message approached the window, her face pale. Samuel did not move. He just closed his eyes for a second and whispered a silent, "Thank you." It was not a triumphant thank you, but a reverent thank you, full of awe for the power he had just witnessed. He knew, even before any official announcement, that the fever his son felt was real. The cockpit door opened, and a member of the ground crew hurried up. He didn't address anyone but the commander. The conversation was short, whispered, but Commander Ribeiro's reaction was visible to all. The red of anger on his face gave way to a deathly pallor. His jaw dropped, his eyes widened in shock and panic. The arrogance he wore like a uniform disintegrated in an instant, revealing a terrified man. He looked over the employee's shoulder, in the direction of Samuel and David, and for the first time, there was no contempt in his gaze, but a deep, almost supernatural astonishment. He looked at the boy not as a problem, but as an incomprehensible enigma. The announcement came over the sound system, but not in the pilot's voice, who seemed to have lost his speech. It was the head of the cabin who communicated, her voice trying to sound calm, but with an unmistakable tremor. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Due to unforeseen technical reasons, this flight has been cancelled. We have detected a Critical problem in the right turbine that compromises the safety of the aircraft. I ask that everyone wait for instructions for disembarkation. The word critical echoed through the plane. The silence that followed was broken by sighs of relief and exclamations of shock. David's fever was a catastrophic failure. The news spread like fire. The maintenance team had discovered a stress fracture in the turbine's hydraulic system, a leak that was causing dangerous overheating. It was a failure. That, according to the technicians, would likely not have withstood the pressure of takeoff. The plane could have lost an engine in mid-air, with unimaginable consequences. The fault had not been detected in the routine inspection carried out hours before. It was the insistence born from the message of an 8-year-old boy that forced a second look, a look that saved the lives of everyone on board. The passengers now looked at David and Samuel in a completely different way. The look of contempt was replaced by a mixture of awe, gratitude, and even a little fear. People didn't know how to react. How do you thank a boy who has just saved your life after you silently witnessed his humiliation? The murmurs of impatience turned into whispers of reverence. "It was the boy," a woman said to her husband. "Did you hear? He warned us." The man in the suit who had complained was pale, staring blankly into space, probably imagining what could have happened. God's justice did not come with a lightning bolt from the sky, but with the silent and powerful revelation of a truth that shamed everyone. The boy they wanted to expel was, in fact, the angel sent to protect them. The disembarkation began, but the usual order had been broken. No one was in a hurry to leave. People moved slowly as if in a trance, and their gazes constantly turned to the seat where Samuel and David were still sitting. Samuel said not a word. He just helped David get out of his seat and picked up their small backpack. He sought no recognition, looked at no one for validation. His peace was internal, a deep calm that came from the certainty that God had acted. He felt no triumph, but an overwhelming humility before the greatness of what had just happened. His son's honor was not restored by men, but by heaven itself, in a way that no one there would ever forget. As Samuel and David began to walk down the aisle, a path opened for them. People instinctively moved back, as if in the presence of something sacred. A man who had previously looked at them with irritation touched Samuel's shoulder as he passed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you." Samuel just nodded, a gesture of acceptance and forgiveness. Another lady, with tears in her eyes, reached out and gently touched David's head. "God bless you, little angel," she said. The humiliation had turned into reverence. They were no longer the outcasts, but the instruments of a visible miracle. Commander Ribeiro stood near the aircraft exit, pale and shrunken. His arrogance had completely evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. When Samuel and David passed him, their eyes met. There were no words. What could be said? The pilot opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His face was a canvas of shock, shame, and an almost existential terror. He had not been confronted by a man, but by the very hand of God, and the realization had broken him. Samuel did not give him an accusatory look. He just passed by, holding his son's hand, letting the silence do the work that no words could. At the boarding gate, the news had already become an event. Airline employees were running back and forth. A senior company representative came directly to meet Samuel. The man in a suit and with a grave expression did not mince words. "Mr. Samuel, on behalf of the entire company, I want to offer you our deepest and most sincere apologies. What happened on board was unacceptable and does not represent the values of our company." He looked at David with evident respect. "And to you, sir," he said to the boy, "our deepest gratitude. You saved all of our lives today." The formality of the address, "Sir," for an 8-year-old child, showed the magnitude of what had happened. The airline acted quickly. Samuel and David were immediately accommodated in a 5-star hotel, with all expenses paid. They received first-class tickets for a flight the next day and an offer of financial compensation that Samuel initially hesitated to accept. He did not want to profit from a miracle. However, the representative insisted, explaining that it was also a way for the company to publicly acknowledge its mistake and the seriousness of the incident. The news about Commander Ribeiro came soon after. He had been immediately suspended from his duties and was under internal investigation. Earthly justice, though slow and imperfect, was beginning to follow in the footsteps of divine justice. That night in the silent, luxurious hotel room, David sat on the bed drawing in a notepad the hotel had provided. He drew a large airplane with a wing that had a red bandage on it and angels flying around it. He was calm, as if the traumatic experience had not shaken him. To him it was simple. God spoke, he listened, his father believed. Children, in their purity, accept miracles with a naturalness that adults lose. Samuel watched him, his heart overflowing, with a love and pride that were almost painful in their intensity. His son was not just his son, he was a little prophet, a channel of God's grace. Samuel remembered a Bible passage his mother always quoted, "But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong." In that airplane aisle, he had felt weak, powerless. He had chosen the path the world would consider foolish, to kneel and pray instead of shouting and demanding. And in the end, the wisdom of men, the technology, the authority of a uniform, were all confounded and shamed by the fever of a metal wing, diagnosed by the faith of a child. The logic of God was indeed inverted, and Samuel felt deeply grateful to have been chosen to witness this truth in such a spectacular way. Later, while David slept soundly, Samuel knelt beside the hotel bed. This time it was not a prayer in the midst of humiliation, but a prayer of pure gratitude. "Thank you, my God. Thank you for protecting my son. Thank you for giving me the strength not to retaliate. Thank you for your justice, which is perfect and comes in your time. Thank you for using me, for using my boy, to show your power. May I never forget this day. May I never forget that it is you who justifies and honors us before men." The tears he did not cry on the plane rolled freely down his face, but they were tears of relief, of awe, and of an overwhelming love for the God who turns humiliation into honor. The next day, as they boarded the new flight, the experience was completely different. They were in first class, treated with a care and respect that bordered on reverence. The new crew knew the story. They looked at David with admiration. The boy, oblivious to it all, just enjoyed the comfortable seat and the orange juice served in a glass cup. For him, the adventure continued. But for Samuel, every kind gesture was a reminder of the turnaround God had brought about. He looked out the window, saw the clouds below, and thought of his mother waiting for them. The journey was no longer just a mission of faith. It was the continuation of a living testimony. They arrived at their destination, and the news had already preceded them. The family received them with emotional hugs and tears of gratitude. David's grandmother, though weak, held her grandson's face in her trembling hands and said, "I always knew you were a special boy. You hear the heart of God." The visit, which was meant to bring comfort, arrived laden with a miracle that strengthened everyone's faith. The story spread through the small church community, becoming a powerful testimony, told and retold, about how the silent faith of a man and the purity of a child could move the hand of God and save hundreds of lives. The humiliation on the plane was not the end of the story. It was just the stage God used to begin his work. Years passed, but the mark of that day never faded. The story became a kind of legend in Samuel's family, a pillar that sustained their faith in times of doubt. David grew up to be a God-fearing young man, with the same spiritual sensitivity that had saved so many lives. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Samuel would look at his son and see not only the man he was becoming, but also the 8-year-old boy pointing at the airplane window. The memory was not a trauma, but a seal, an eternal covenant that reminded Samuel that the most important battles are won on one's knees, and that true strength lies not in fighting back, but in trusting. Commander Ribeiro never flew a commercial plane again. The internal investigation revealed a history of complaints from passengers and crew about his arrogant and discriminatory behavior. That incident was not an isolated case, but the last straw that broke the camel's back, a camel laden with prejudice and abuse of power. The cancellation of the flight and the discovery of the catastrophic failure brought to light what many already knew but feared to say. Divine justice in saving lives also exposed the darkness that hid behind a uniform and a position of authority. The price God exacted was not just the loss of his job, but the eternal weight of knowing that his pride almost cost the lives of hundreds of people, saved precisely by those he tried to humiliate. The story of Samuel and David became a beacon. It was told in churches, in small prayer groups, and eventually spread beyond their community. it became a testimony. About prejudice, faith, and divine intervention, it showed that the voice of God is not restricted to pulpits or to renowned men. It can come in the whisper of a child, in the intuition of a pure heart, in the simple language of a fever, in a metal wing. It showed that in the court of heaven humility has more authority than arrogance, and that an act of faith can have far more powerful and lasting consequences than any act of aggression. To this day, when Samuel works with wood in his workshop, he remembers the metal of that turbine. He understands that both wood and metal can have flaws, invisible fissures that can compromise the entire structure, and he understands that the same applies to the human heart. The pilot's prejudice was a fissure in his soul, which almost led everyone to destruction. Samuel's faith, on the other hand, was the strength that allowed God to inspect and reveal the danger. He learned that life requires constant checks, not just on machines, but especially on our own spirit, to ensure there are no cracks of hatred, pride, or injustice. That day, in an airplane aisle, everyone learned that true authority does not come from a uniform or a position of power, but from the voice of God, who often chooses to speak through the humblest to protect his own. The humiliation of Samuel and David was not forgotten, but it was re-signified. It became the preface to a miracle, the proof that God can turn the stage of our greatest shame into the altar of our greatest honor. His justice not only righted a wrong, but rewrote the story, leaving an indelible lesson for all who were on board and for all who later heard the account of that flight that never took off. If you know someone who needs their faith strengthened, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about how faith in God can move mountains. Thank you for listening.